Sometimes silence weighs heavier than 1,000 screams of pain. For 40 years, every time I opened my mouth to speak, I tasted fear on the tongue they threatened to cut out. Good morning, my dears. My name is Emily Thornton. I'm 84 years old, and today I'm going to share with you a secret I kept for 40 years. Before I begin, I'd like to ask you to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of my stories. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. I love knowing my words reach places I might never have the opportunity to visit personally. Now for my story. I was born in rural Virginia, into a simple, hard-working family. My father was a carpenter and my mother a seamstress. I grew up learning that honesty and hard work were the greatest values anyone could have. I dreamed of becoming a teacher, but fate had other plans for me. Plans that began like a fairy tale but quickly transformed into a nightmare from which I couldn't awaken. It was 1956. I was only 19 when I met Richard Thornton during a church social. He was tall, educated, had a gentle smile, and came from one of the most important families in the region. The Thorntons owned the largest tobacco plantation in the state, and their name was synonymous with power and respect. I remember my racing heart when he asked me to dance, the butterflies in my stomach when he asked permission to visit me the following Sunday. My parents were ecstatic at the idea that a Thornton was interested in their daughter. "This is an opportunity God has placed in your path," my mother said. My father, more cautious, only advised me, "Don't let the glitter of gold blind you to a man's character." Wise words that, unfortunately, I didn't fully comprehend at that time. The courtship was brief and intense. 3 months later, Richard asked for my hand in marriage. The engagement ring, with a diamond that seemed larger than anything our family had ever owned, sealed the commitment. The wedding was at the city cathedral, with 600 guests, most of them strangers to me. I wore a French silk dress, specially imported for the occasion, chosen not by me, but by Mrs. Eleanor Thornton, my future mother-in-law. That was the first sign of what my life would be like from then on. Eleanor Thornton was an imposing woman, always impeccably dressed, with discreet but valuable jewelry, and a gaze that seemed to continuously evaluate whether you were worthy of breathing the same air as her. During the wedding preparations, she took control of everything, from the menu to the guest list. "Dear," she would tell me with a cold smile, "the Thorntons have traditions to maintain. You'll learn soon enough." I would nod, grateful for the guidance, not realizing those weren't tips, they were orders. The ceremony was grandiose, but what I remember most clearly was the tightness in my chest when I entered the church. It wasn't just the emotion of the big day. It was a premonition that I ignored, burying it under the carpet of dreams I had woven. My father, when giving me away at the altar, whispered, "It's not too late to change your mind." I smiled nervously, thinking it was just a father's natural fear when giving away his daughter. Today I know he saw something that I, blinded by the promise of a better life, failed to see. After our honeymoon in Paris, an experience as dazzling as it was disorienting for a girl from rural Virginia who had never left the state, we moved to the Thornton estate. The property was impressive. A main house in colonial style with 12 bedrooms, gardens that seemed to come from a European palace, and more than 50 staff just for the maintenance of the house and grounds. There were also the tobacco plantations that extended beyond what the eye could see, employing hundreds of workers. My arrival at the estate as the new Mrs. Thornton should have been the beginning of a life of joy and fulfillment. Instead, it was the beginning of my erasure. From the first day, Eleanor made it clear that, although I was Richard's wife, she would continue to run the house. "You are very young and inexperienced," she would say. "I will allow you to learn gradually how to manage a property like this." Allow. This word summarized my position in the family hierarchy. Richard, who had seemed so attentive and decisive during courtship in his mother's presence, transformed into an obedient boy. All decisions, from the simplest to the most important, passed through Eleanor's filter. When I tried to redecorate our bedroom, I was gently informed that the decoration of the main house follows a pattern established for generations. When I suggested inviting my parents for Sunday lunch, Eleanor explained that the family's social calendar was already full for the coming months. The first months were about adaptation and hope. I told myself it was just a phase, that with time I would conquer my space, that Richard would eventually notice the situation and intervene. He was affectionate when we were alone, but whenever issues arose that required a stance, he withdrew with the excuse that Mother knows what's best for all of us. 9 months after the wedding, our first child, David, was born. The delivery was difficult, and I was bedridden for several weeks. During this period, Eleanor completely took over the care of the baby. When I recovered and tried to establish a routine with my son, I discovered there was already one determined by my mother-in-law. Feeding times, bath times, walks, everything was already defined. The hired nanny reported directly to her, not to me. "My dear," Eleanor would say with that smile that never reached her eyes, "you should focus on regaining your strength. David is in excellent hands." And so little by little, I was pushed away from my own child. When I insisted on participating more actively, I was subtly discouraged. "I notice you get nervous when he cries. That's not good for the baby." Or, "I noticed you seem tired when you care for him alone. There's no need to exhaust yourself. We have an excellent staff." As the months passed, the feeling of not belonging grew. The estate, immense and beautiful, became my golden prison. My contacts with family and the few friends I had were gradually reduced. Letters I wrote mysteriously went missing. Visits were canceled at the last minute due to unforeseen circumstances. Phone calls were filtered by the housekeeper, who always seemed to have an excuse for why I couldn't answer. Richard, between business trips and responsibilities at the estate, seemed increasingly distant. When I tried to share my concerns, he minimized them. "You're exaggerating, Emily. Mother only wants what's best for our family." Or, "You need to try harder to adapt to our way of life." With time, I learned to keep my thoughts to myself. Silence began to become my most faithful companion. The family doctor, Dr. Lawrence, an elegant middle-aged man who frequently visited the estate, started prescribing me tranquilizers. "You're suffering from nervousness," he diagnosed after I had a crying fit when they prevented me from taking David to visit my parents. "These pills will help you feel more balanced." What started with an occasional pill soon turned into a dependency. The pills left me numb, easier to control. There were days when I could barely remember what had happened in the previous hours. The relationship between Eleanor and Dr. Lawrence always intrigued me. They had long conversations behind closed doors, and sometimes I caught glances between them that suggested an intimacy beyond the friendship between a longtime patient and her doctor. But in that medication-induced state of confusion, I doubted my own perceptions. The turning point came on a night of heavy storm in 1960. Richard was traveling, as he always did during the first week of each month. David, then 3 years old, had a high fever, and I, desperate, was looking for more blankets in the attic of the house. It was there, among old trunks and furniture covered by sheets, that I found a carved wooden box with the initials ETL, Eleanor Thornton and Lawrence, I presumed. Normally, I would never have invaded someone's privacy, but something that night, perhaps desperation over my son's health, perhaps the reduced effect of the medications I was secretly trying to decrease, gave me the courage I had never had. The box was locked, but the key was in the lock, as if someone had put it away in a hurry. Inside, I found letters, many letters, dating back more than 20 years. Love letters exchanged between Eleanor and Lawrence. Letters that revealed a relationship that began even before Richard's birth. Letters that made it clear that my husband was not the son of William Thornton, the deceased patriarch whom I knew only from portraits solemnly hung on the walls of the house, but of Dr. Lawrence. But there was more, much more. I found Eleanor's diary, where she described how William had discovered the truth and threatened to disinherit her, take everything from her, including her son. And then the most disturbing entry, dated 1 week before William's death. L promised a solution. Says he has an infallible method that will look natural. I fear the consequences, but I fear more losing everything we've built. My hands trembled as I read. William Thornton had not died of a heart attack as everyone believed. He had been slowly poisoned with substances that Lawrence, as a doctor, had easy access to. The patriarch of the family, the man whose portrait observed me severely from the dining room wall every night, had been murdered to protect a secret and a fortune. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't hear the footsteps on the attic stairs. When the door opened, I nearly had a heart attack seeing Eleanor standing there, a dark figure silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Her eyes, usually cold and calculating, now burned with a fury I had never seen before. "What do you think you're doing?" She advanced toward me. I tried to explain about the blankets, about David being sick, but the words wouldn't come out. She looked at the open box, at the letters scattered on the floor, and her face transformed. For a moment, I thought she would attack me physically. Instead, she did something much worse. With a terrifying calmness, she bent down until her face was inches from mine and said, "If a word about this leaves your mouth, I'll cut out your tongue and you'll be committed as insane. You'll never see your children again. I have doctors, judges, and politicians in my pocket. You are nobody, Emily. Nobody will believe you." It wasn't an empty threat. In the few years I had spent in that house, I had seen the power the Thorntons wielded in the region. I had seen how authorities bowed, how favors were granted, how problems simply disappeared. And now, with what I had discovered, I understood better than ever how much Eleanor would be willing to do to protect her empire. That night, as I held my feverish son in my arms, I made the decision that would define the next 4 decades of my life. I would remain silent for David's sake, for my own sake. I would pretend I had never seen those letters, that I had never discovered the sordid truth behind the respectable facade of the Thornton family. And so began my long winter of silence. In the days that followed, I realized something had fundamentally changed in the dynamics of the house. The surveillance over me, which was already constant, intensified. A new maid was assigned to help me, or rather, to spy on me. My pills, which I was secretly trying to reduce, were now personally administered by Eleanor or the housekeeper, who would watch until I swallowed them. My contacts with the outside world, already limited, were practically eliminated. The rare visits from my parents were suspended under the pretext that I was very nervous and needed absolute tranquility. Letters I wrote never reached their destination. The telephone extension in my room was removed for technical reasons, and always, there was the silent threat hanging in the air. Eleanor's gaze followed me around the house, constantly reminding me of the price I would pay if I dared to speak. Sometimes, during dinner, she would casually mention some acquaintance who had been committed to a psychiatric institution. Poor thing, she started saying nonsense things, creating stories. The family had no choice. I was trapped not by physical chains, but by something much stronger. Fear. Fear of losing my son. Fear of being declared insane. Fear of ending up in one of those terrible institutions from which one heard hair-raising stories. And so, day after day, I sank deeper into silence, which would become my prison for 40 long years. The following years were like living in a cotton world. The medications they forced me to take left my thoughts foggy, words jumbled in my mind before they could reach my lips. Even so, I learned to adapt, to find small cracks in the constant surveillance, rare moments of clarity when I could decrease the doses without them noticing. In 1962, I discovered I was pregnant again. The news, which should have filled me with joy, brought me only silent anguish. Another child under Eleanor's control, another innocent being entangled in this web of lies and manipulation. Still, when I held my daughter Caroline in my arms for the first time, I felt a renewed determination. For her, for David, I needed to continue fighting, even if it was an invisible battle, fought in the recesses of my own mind. Richard remained as absent as before, traveling frequently on business, always submissive to his mother when at home. Sometimes, in the rare moments when we were alone, I noticed a lost look on his face, as if a part of him was also imprisoned. I wondered if he suspected the truth about his origin, if he intuitively felt something wasn't right, but I never had the courage to bring up the subject. The shadow of Eleanor's threat was too long. "You're improving, Emily," Eleanor would comment during our lunches on the veranda, observing how I behaved exactly as she expected, docile, quiet, unquestioning. "The medicines are really helping with your nerves." I would nod and smile slightly, knowing that my apparent submission was my only protection. Inside, however, a small flame of resistance remained lit. In 1965, our third child, Michael, was born. The delivery was difficult, and for weeks I was more medicated than ever, floating between consciousness and long periods of sleep. When I finally regained some lucidity, I discovered I barely knew my own baby. As had happened with David and Caroline, Eleanor had taken control, established routines, hired a nanny who reported directly to her. "Ma'am was very weak," the housekeeper justified, when I questioned why they didn't call me when the baby cried during the night. "Mrs. Thornton thought it best to let you rest." Always Eleanor, always deciding what was best for all of us. The years passed with a suffocating monotony. The seasons succeeded one another, marked only by the changes in the landscape of the estate that I observed through my bedroom window. Springs, summers, autumns, and winters merged into an indistinct mass of time. The children grew before my eyes, but always kept at an emotional distance from me. "Mommy is tired today," I heard Eleanor tell them when they tried to seek me out. "Mommy needs her medicine to get better." Gradually, my own children began to look at me with a mixture of pity and distrust, as if I were a stranger too fragile to be part of their lives. It was during these foggy years that I learned to create small pockets of resistance. I began to spit out some of the pills when no one was looking, hiding them in a crack in the wall behind my bed's headboard. When I felt more lucid, I took advantage to observe, to memorize, to understand the patterns of the house, who came, who went, which were the days when Eleanor and Dr. Lawrence met behind closed doors in the office. Dr. Lawrence continued to be a constant presence in our lives. Over the years, I noticed how he looked at Richard with a mixture of pride and guilt. On certain occasions, when he thought no one was watching, he would discreetly touch my husband's shoulder or study his profile with a disturbing intensity. Richard, in turn, showed him a respect that bordered on veneration, much greater than any feeling he directed toward the portrait of the man he believed to be his father. In 1968, my parents passed away within months of each other. I received the news through Eleanor, who handed me an already opened telegram. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said with an icy formality. "Unfortunately, you're in no condition to travel for the funeral." I cried alone in my room, devastated not only by the loss, but by not being able to say goodbye, by not having been present in the last years of their lives. The guilt for having distanced myself from them, even if not by my own choice, was an additional weight on my already bent shoulders. It was after my parents' death that I realized I was truly alone. There was no one outside that estate who cared about me anymore, who might notice my disappearance or question my absence. The world out there continued to turn, unaware of the woman who was slowly fading within the walls of the Thornton mansion. My only comfort was my children, although the relationship with them was complicated by Eleanor's constant interference. David, the oldest, was the one who looked most like Richard in appearance, but had a curiosity and determination that reminded me more of myself before marriage. Caroline was quiet and observant, with a talent for music that enchanted even Eleanor. Michael, the youngest, was more introspective, preferring the company of books to people, perhaps a response to the oppressive atmosphere of the house. When I managed moments of clarity, I tried to approach them, to tell stories from my childhood, to teach small things I had learned from my own mother. Sometimes, in the rare moments when Eleanor was visiting friends in town, or when Richard took her for medical consultations in Richmond, I felt I could establish a genuine connection with my children. But these occasions were too brief, and soon the suffocating routine would reinstate itself. As the 1970s approached, I noticed subtle changes in the dynamics of the house. Eleanor, now nearing 70, was beginning to show signs of aging. Her posture was no longer so erect, her step no longer so firm. Dr. Lawrence came more frequently, and his closed-door consultations lasted longer. His visits now included a nurse who stayed in one of the guest rooms. Taking advantage of the focus diverted from me, I began to reduce my medication even more, hiding pills in increasingly ingenious places. Gradually, my mind cleared, and I began to more actively plan how I could protect my children and perhaps, one day, reveal the truth. 1972 brought a significant change. David, then 15, would be sent to a boarding school in the capital. "It's a family tradition," Eleanor explained during dinner. "All Thornton men receive an excellent education to take over the business." Richard nodded proudly, not noticing how my heart broke at the prospect of losing daily contact with my firstborn. The night before David's departure, I managed a rare moment alone with him. The housekeeper had retired early with a headache, and Eleanor was busy in her room with the nurse. I found my son in the library, packing some books he wanted to take. "Are you happy about this change?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. David looked at me with an expression that mixed surprise and curiosity. It was rare for me to initiate a conversation, rarer still for us to be alone. "I think so," he answered cautiously. "Grandmother says it's important for my future." "Grandmother says many things," I murmured. And then, gathering a courage I didn't know I still possessed, I added, "Not all are true." I saw the astonishment on his face, followed by a spark of interest. For a moment, I considered telling everything, unburdening the terrible weight I had carried for more than a decade. But the fear was too strong, too deeply rooted. What if Eleanor found out? What if she carried out her threat? I couldn't risk it. "What do you mean, Mom?" David asked, approaching. Just promise me you'll think for yourself," I responded, holding his hands. "That you'll question what they tell you, that you'll seek your own answers, and that you'll never, never forget that I love you, even when I seem absent." He nodded, confused but attentive. Before I could say more, we heard footsteps in the hallway. I quickly returned to the submissive posture I had perfected over the years, commenting casually about the weather as the housekeeper entered the library. In the months that followed David's departure, I plunged into a period of deep melancholy. The letters he sent always arrived opened, obviously read by Eleanor before reaching my hands. They were formal letters, full of accounts of his studies and new friendships, but empty of the intimacy we had begun to build. When he returned for holidays, he was always surrounded by Eleanor, who organized dinners and receptions to showcase the future of the Thornton family. In 1975, David returned for summer vacation transformed. At 18, he was taller, more confident, and there was something different in his gaze. An intensity, a determination that wasn't there before. During one of the formal dinners that Eleanor regularly organized, I noticed how he carefully observed the interaction between his grandmother and Dr. Lawrence, how his eyes narrowed when he saw me taking the pills that were still administered to me daily. One afternoon, while I was resting in the winter garden, David approached, making sure we were alone, sat beside me, and without preamble asked, "Mom, why do you take so many medicines?" The direct question caught me off guard. It was the first time in years that someone openly questioned my medication. I hesitated, torn between the desire to open my heart and the deeply rooted fear. "For the nerves," I automatically replied, repeating the explanation I had heard hundreds of times. "Dr. Lawrence says I need them to stay balanced." "And do you believe that?" he insisted, his eyes fixed on mine. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications. For a moment, I considered lying, continuing the facade that had become my life. but something in my son's gaze, perhaps the same determination I had lost over the years, gave me courage. "No!" I whispered so low that he had to lean in to hear. "I don't believe it." I saw the impact of my words on his face, the understanding dawning in his eyes. Before I could say more, we heard Eleanor's voice calling from the hallway. David quickly squeezed my hand and stood up. "We'll talk more," he promised. And then, in a loud voice for anyone who might be listening, "Rest well, Mom. You look tired today." In the following weeks, David found ingenious ways to create private moments between us. Casual questions asked when we passed each other in the hallways. Seemingly innocent conversations during garden walks that could be observed but not heard. Small notes hidden in the books he lent me. Little by little, I revealed fragments of the truth. How the medicines had started soon after his birth. How my communication with the outside world had been cut off. How I felt constantly watched, controlled. I didn't mention the bigger secret, the diary, the letters, the truth about Richard's birth and William's death. The fear was still too strong. Eleanor's threat still echoed in my ears. It was David who, on his own, began to interfere with my medication. "We've swapped some of your pills," he revealed in a note. "Caroline is helping me. You'll start to feel your mind clearer in the coming days." And so it was. Gradually, the fog that had enveloped my thoughts for so many years began to dissipate. I began to notice things I had ignored, connections I hadn't made. How Eleanor seemed increasingly fragile, more dependent on Dr. Lawrence. How Richard took on more responsibilities in the business, but continued to seek his mother's approval for each decision. How Caroline and Michael, now teenagers, developed their own strategies to deal with the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Mental clarity brought both relief and pain. Finally, I could think lucidly, plan, dream of a possible liberation, but it also meant fully facing the reality of the lost years, the opportunities I never had, the mother I couldn't be to my children. On a rainy night, a few days before David's return to boarding school, he found me alone in the library. In a low voice, he revealed his plan. "I'm going to study medicine, Mom. I'm going to find out what these medicines really do to you, and when I graduate, I'll free you from them once and for all." I felt a mixture of pride and terror. Pride for the determined man my son was becoming. Terror for what Eleanor might do if she discovered his plans. "Be careful," I implored, holding his hands. "She's more dangerous than you imagine." "I know," he responded with a wisdom beyond his years. "I realized that a long time ago. There's something wrong in this house, something beyond the medicines they force you to take, and I'm going to find out what it is." Before I could warn him about the risks, about the terrible secret I had discovered that stormy night so many years ago, we were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Quickly, David picked up a book from the shelf and began leafing through it while I returned to my embroidery, once again assuming the mask of docility that had become my protection. The next day, Eleanor announced she had made arrangements for David to continue his studies in Europe. "An exceptional opportunity," she explained during lunch. "The best professors, international connections that will be valuable for the future of the family business." I looked at my son, seeing in his eyes that he perfectly understood what was happening. Eleanor had noticed our approach, noticed the change in my behavior, and was separating us before we could strengthen our alliance further. On the eve of his departure, David managed one last moment alone with me. "This isn't goodbye," he assured, his voice firm despite the emotion. "I'll continue our plan, even from a distance. And one day, Mom, I'll free you from this prison." As the car took him to the airport the next morning, I stood at my bedroom window, watching until it disappeared around the bend in the road. A part of me was leaving with him, the part that had begun to believe liberation was possible. But another part, the one that had learned to survive during so many years of silence, knew I would need to continue resisting day after day until that promise could be fulfilled. The years that followed David's departure for Europe were the loneliest of my life. His absence left a void that seemed impossible to fill, despite the presence of Caroline and Michael in the house. Eleanor, always vigilant, intensified her control over me. My medicines returned to being administered with implacable rigor, always under direct supervision, making any attempt to avoid them impossible. "It's for your own good, Emily," she repeated with that cold smile that never reached her eyes. "You seemed so agitated in the last weeks before David's departure." The letters from my son arrived regularly, but always passed through Eleanor's filter before reaching my hands. They were formal letters talking about his medical studies at the University of Heidelberg in Germany, about the European climate, about the cultural differences he encountered. To inattentive eyes, they would seem just accounts of a young man excited about his new life. But for me, who had learned to read between the lines during years of oppression, there were hidden messages. "The university library is fascinating, Mom. I'm researching historical treatments for nervousness and how many were used more for control than for cure. I've been learning a lot about how certain substances can alter perception and memory." I immediately understood what he was investigating, the medications that had been administered to me for so many years. In another letter, months later, he mentioned, "I met a very interesting professor who worked in several hospitals in Europe. He has been guiding me in research on medical ethics and the misuse of authority by certain professionals. Really disturbing stories he shared about doctors who abused their patients' trust." My heart raced as I read these words. David was investigating not just my situation, but possibly Dr. Lawrence's past as well. I felt a mixture of hope and terror. Hope that finally the truth might come to light, terror for what Eleanor might do if she discovered. The 1970s advanced, bringing subtle changes to the structure of the house. Eleanor, now in her 70s, began to show more evident signs of physical fragility, although her control over the family remained unwavering. Dr. Lawrence, equally aged, came with even greater frequency, often spending the night in one of the guest rooms, under the pretext of monitoring her health. Caroline, my middle child, turned 18 in 1977, and, to my surprise, managed to convince her grandmother to allow her to study music at the conservatory in the capital, instead of following the traditional path of women in the family, which usually involved arranged marriages to sons of other powerful families. "She has exceptional talent," argued the private tutor who came to the estate to give piano lessons. "It would be a waste not to develop it properly." To my surprise, Eleanor yielded. Perhaps she was becoming softer with age, or perhaps she simply saw an opportunity to rid herself of another family member who might question her authority. Either way, Caroline's departure left the house even quieter, reducing my immediate circle to just Michael, who at 12 was quiet and introverted, preferring the company of books to people. It was at the end of that same year that I noticed a subtle change in the dynamics between Richard and his mother. My husband, always so submissive, began to express his own opinions during dinners, to question some decisions related to the family business. They weren't direct challenges, just small disagreements. But for someone who knew the dynamics of the house like I did, they represented a silent revolution. "I think we should modernize the harvesting process," he said one night while discussing the next tobacco crop. "Traditional methods are respectable, but we're losing competitiveness." Eleanor stared at him with a mixture of surprise and irritation. "The Thorntons have harvested tobacco the same way for 3 generations, Richard. Your father—" "My father has been dead for almost 30 years, Mother," he interrupted with a firmness he had never shown before. "And the world has changed since then." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with unspoken tensions. For the first time, I saw a flash of uncertainty in Eleanor's eyes, a brief moment of vulnerability that she quickly masked by changing the subject. I wondered what had provoked this change in Richard. Was it the physical distance of the children, allowing him to see the situation more clearly? Or perhaps the growing weight of business responsibilities, forcing him to make independent decisions? Whatever the reason, I observed with cautious interest, seeking in this new dynamic possible paths for my own liberation. The year 1979 brought an unexpected turn. During breakfast, Eleanor opened a letter addressed to Richard, and her face visibly paled. Without saying a word, she rose from the table and headed to the office, locking herself inside for hours. Later that day, Dr. Lawrence arrived in an unscheduled visit, and the two remained in heated conversations until late at night. Only days later did I discover the reason for so much agitation. David was returning to the United States, having completed part of his studies in Germany. He would finish his medical training in Boston, just a few hours away from the estate. "Your son is returning," Eleanor announced during dinner, with a studied neutrality that couldn't completely hide her concern. "He expressed a desire to visit on weekends when possible." I kept my expression neutral, despite the joy exploding in my chest. My son was coming back, and from the reactions of Eleanor and Dr. Lawrence, he brought with him something that deeply worried them. David's first visit occurred on a sunny Sunday in September. When the car crossed the estate gates, I couldn't contain my tears. It had been almost 5 years since his departure for Europe, and the young man getting out of the car now was a grown man, with a confident posture and eyes that reflected knowledge and determination. Lunch was a tense occasion, with superficial conversations about his experiences in Europe, carefully avoiding any mention of his specific studies or future plans. Eleanor maintained a fixed smile, interrupting whenever the conversation seemed to take more personal turns. Dr. Lawrence, specially invited for the occasion, observed David with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Only at the end of the afternoon, when we managed a brief moment alone in the garden, did David whisper, "I found things, Mom, things that will change everything, but we need time and caution." Before I could respond, Eleanor appeared on the terrace, calling us for tea. The moment had passed, but the promise remained, pulsing like a small flame of hope in my chest. David's visits became regular every 2 or 3 weeks. Each time, he seemed to bring with him a new energy to the house, a fresh breeze that disturbed the stagnant air of decades of secrets. I noticed how he carefully observed Dr. Lawrence, how he asked seemingly innocent questions about family history, how he studied the old portraits hanging on the walls. During one of these visits, in early 1980, David brought a guest, a young female doctor named Sarah, whom he introduced as a college colleague. Eleanor couldn't hide her displeasure at the unexpected presence, but maintained appearances, offering formal hospitality. During lunch, Sarah casually mentioned she had worked at a hospital in Munich. "I met an American doctor who worked there in the 50s, she commented, looking directly at Dr. Lawrence. A brilliant man by all accounts, although there was some controversy about his treatment methods. I saw Dr. Lawrence's face pale, his fingers tightly gripping the napkin. Eleanor quickly intervened, changing the subject, but the damage was done. A seed of doubt had been planted, visible in Richard's thoughtful expression, in the sharp look of Michael, who at 17 absorbed everything with the silent insight he had developed. After the visitor's departure, the atmosphere in the house became even tenser. Eleanor and Dr. Lawrence spent hours locked in the office, and several times I heard them arguing in muffled voices. My medication was increased again, presumably to prevent me from noticing what was happening. But I had learned over the years to pretend the medicines had more effect than they really did. On a particularly agitated night, I accidentally overheard a fragment of conversation as I passed through the hallway near the office. "He knows Eleanor. Somehow he found out about Munich." Dr. Lawrence's voice sounded anguished. "Impossible. Those records were destroyed," Eleanor replied, her voice trembling with anger or fear. I couldn't tell which. Someone talked, someone who was there. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of a glass breaking, followed by a loaded silence. I moved away quickly, my heart beating hard against my ribs. Munich. What had happened in Munich that left them so disturbed? The pieces were slowly falling into place. David's letters mentioning his research on medical ethics, Sarah's reference to the hospital in Munich, Dr. Lawrence's poorly disguised panic. There was something in his past, something that David had discovered during his years in Germany. In the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in Richard's behavior. He spent more time in the office reviewing old documents. He made private calls, seemed more distant and thoughtful during meals. Once I caught him staring fixedly at William Thornton's portrait, studying the features of the man he believed to be his father. David returned on a rainy afternoon in May, this time alone. He brought with him a folder that he guarded carefully, never letting it out of his sight. During dinner, he announced he had made an important discovery for his doctoral thesis. "I'm researching questionable medical practices in the post-war period," he explained, carefully observing the reactions around the table. "It's fascinating how certain professionals manage to escape scrutiny by changing countries, establishing new identities." Dr. Lawrence, present as always at Sunday dinners, choked on his wine, needing several moments to regain his composure. Eleanor gave David an icy look, while Richard seemed genuinely interested, asking for more details. "Actually, Dad," continued David, "I found a particularly interesting case of a doctor who lost his license in Germany after several patients died under his care. Experimental medications, fabricated diagnoses, a true study on the abuse of medical power." The silence that followed was deafening. You could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the sound of rain against the windows, Dr. Lawrence's accelerated breathing. "I think this kind of conversation isn't appropriate for dinner," Eleanor intervened, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to appear controlled. "Richard, why don't you tell us about the new export contracts?" But Richard, for the first time that I could remember, completely ignored his mother's suggestion. His eyes were fixed on David, an expression of growing understanding dawning on his face. "This doctor," he asked slowly. "What was his name?" "Dr." Lawrence rose abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I need to withdraw," he announced, his face red and sweaty. "I'm not feeling well." "Sit down, Lawrence," ordered Eleanor, her voice sharp as a razor. "This is ridiculous. David is just sharing his academic research. There's no reason for alarm." But there was, and everyone at the table now realized it. Something fundamental was changing. A balance carefully maintained for decades was beginning to crumble before my eyes. After dinner, Richard invited David for a private conversation in the office. Eleanor tried to intervene, insisting she should be present, but for the first time my husband confronted her directly. "No, Mother," he said with a firmness he had never shown before. "This is a conversation between me and my son." I stayed in my room, anxiously waiting, imagining what might be being revealed in that conversation. From the windows, I observed Dr. Lawrence hastily leaving the house, getting into his car, and departing into the rainy night, the headlights briefly illuminating the raindrops before disappearing into the darkness. Hours later, Richard came to my room, something he rarely did. His face was pale, his eyes red as if he had cried or held back tears. "Emily," he said, sitting heavily on the edge of the bed, "I think we need to talk. There are things that David discovered about Lawrence, about my mother, about me." In that moment, I understood that the moment I had both feared and simultaneously awaited had finally arrived. The truth, buried for so long under layers of lies, threats, and manipulation, was emerging to the surface. The secret that had forced me into 40 years of silence was about to be revealed. "You already knew, didn't you?" Richard asked, his eyes searching mine. "All this time, you knew." I felt the weight of 4 decades of forced silence, of constant fear, of medications that clouded my mind. I also felt a growing wave of something I hadn't experienced in a long time. Courage? "Yes," I finally answered, my voice hoarse with emotion. "I knew, and there's much more you need to know." Dawn found us still talking, unearthing painful truths, connecting the dots of a dark story that had shaped our lives without us realizing it. Richard listened, sometimes incredulous, sometimes furious, sometimes simply devastated by the dimension of the lies that had built his world. When the sun rose, illuminating the room with a golden light, I felt as if something was also being born within me, the hope that perhaps I could finally find my voice again. The days that followed my conversation with Richard were filled with palpable tension at the Thornton estate. The air seemed charged with electricity, like in the moments preceding a great storm. Eleanor noticed the change immediately, her sharp eyes catching every glance exchanged between Richard and me, every conversation interrupted when she entered a room. "You two seem very close lately," she commented during breakfast, her tone apparently casual, but loaded with suspicion. "It's good to see this rapprochement after so many years." Richard just nodded, avoiding her gaze. I noticed how he now observed his mother with new eyes, no longer with the blind devotion of a son, but with the critical gaze of someone who finally saw the manipulator behind the maternal mask. Dr. Lawrence did not return to the estate in the following days, claiming through a phone call that he was indisposed. His absence was deafening, an empty space that screamed truths not yet fully confronted. At the end of that week, David returned bringing more documents with him. Caroline, alerted by him, came from the capital to join us. Only Michael, who was in his last year at boarding school, remained absent. It was better that way, I thought. He was still too young to face the storm that was about to break over our family. We gathered in the office of the estate, a place that had always been Eleanor's inviolable sanctuary, and before her, William's. David carefully spread several papers on the antique mahogany desk. Copies of medical records, newspaper clippings, signed testimonies. "I found the old gardener of the estate, Mr. Jenkins," explained David. "He worked here for more than 50 years, since before Dad's birth. He's 92 now, living in a nursing home in Roanoke." Richard picked up one of the testimonies, his eyes quickly scanning the handwritten lines. His face visibly paled. "He claims he saw my mother and Lawrence planning my father's death. Williams," he quickly corrected himself. "Says he heard them discussing dosages that wouldn't leave marks, that would look like a natural heart attack." Caroline, who until then had listened in silence, let out a sob. "This can't be true," she murmured, her fingers tightening on the cross she always wore around her neck. "Grandma wouldn't do that." "There's more," continued David, pulling another set of documents, records from the Munich hospital, where Lawrence worked in the 50s before returning to the United States. He lost his medical license after the suspicious death of 5 patients. All presented the same symptoms, progressive deterioration of health without apparent cause. As David spoke, a final piece of the puzzle fell into place in my mind. The nerve pills I had been forced to take for decades weren't just to keep me docile and controlled. They were part of an ongoing experimentation, an extension of the practices that had cost Lawrence his license in Germany. "He tested drugs on me," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a punch. "All these years." Richard held my hand, his eyes shining with a contained fury I had never seen in him before. "And there's also this," concluded David, removing a sealed envelope from his folder. "The result of the DNA test I did with samples from you, Dad, and from William Thornton's portrait." The silence that followed was absolute. Through the office windows, you could hear the birds singing in the garden, the distant sound of workers in the plantations, normal life continuing oblivious to the earthquake shaking the foundations of our family. Richard stared at the envelope for long moments, as if it contained not just the results of an exam, but the entire redefinition of his existence. Finally, with trembling fingers, he opened it and removed a single sheet of paper. I didn't need to read the content to know the result. The expression on my husband's face said it all. "I'm not his son," Richard murmured, his voice barely audible. "My entire life based on a lie." Before we could fully absorb the impact of that revelation, the office door opened. Eleanor was standing in the doorway, her body fragile from the years, but her eyes still shining with the same iron determination as always. Behind her, like a shadow, was Dr. Lawrence, his face a mask of false concern, barely disguising the fear. "What is this?" Eleanor asked, her gaze scanning the documents spread on the desk. "What kind of family meeting is this to which I wasn't invited?" "A meeting about truths, Mother," Richard answered, slowly rising. "Truths that have been hidden for too long." I saw the exact moment when Eleanor understood what was happening. A brief flash of panic crossed her face, quickly replaced by a mask of offended indignation. "What absurdity is this? What papers are these?" She advanced, trying to collect the documents from the desk. Caroline, with surprising quickness, interposed herself between her grandmother and the evidence. "We know everything, Grandma," said my daughter, her voice trembling but firm. "About Dr. Lawrence, about what you did to Grandpa William." Lawrence took a step back, as if wanting to flee, but David was already positioned at the door, blocking his exit. "You tested on my mother the same drugs that killed those patients in Munich, didn't you?" he asked, his voice loaded with controlled fury. "For 40 years, using her as a guinea pig for your experiments." The doctor paled, seeking Eleanor's support with his gaze. She, however, was focused on Richard, who now held the DNA test result toward her. "You told me William was my father," he said, his voice strangely calm. "Another lie, isn't it, among so many?" For a long moment, Eleanor remained silent, her gaze passing from one face to another, evaluating, calculating. Then suddenly, something changed in her expression. Her shoulders, always erect with pride, fell slightly. A deep sigh escaped her thin lips. "You wouldn't understand," she finally said, addressing Richard. "None of you would understand what it meant to be a woman in that time, married to a man like William, cruel, controlling, who treated me like property." "So you killed him," stated Richard, not a question, but a statement loaded with horror. "He found out about Lawrence and me," continued Eleanor, ignoring the accusation. "He threatened to take everything from me, you, the estate, my social position, said he would commit me as insane and no one would ever believe me." Her words echoed disturbingly with the threat she herself had made to me decades ago. History repeating itself in a perverse cycle of abuse and control. "And what about Mom?" Caroline intervened, pointing to me. "Why keep her drugged all these years? Why keep her away from us?" Eleanor turned her eyes to me, and for the first time I saw something I had never noticed before. Fear. She feared me, feared what I knew, what I might reveal. "She saw things she shouldn't have," Eleanor answered dryly. "She represented a risk." "A risk that you preferred to neutralize with experimental drugs," completed David, his voice loaded with disgust. "Dr. Lawrence needed guinea pigs for his research, didn't he? And Mom was perfect, isolated, without external contacts, completely at your mercy." Lawrence, cornered, finally spoke. "They were just sedatives, nothing dangerous, to keep her calm, for her own good." "You lost your license in Germany for killing patients with these harmless sedatives," retorted David. "The same compounds I found in my mother's blood samples when I examined her during my last visit." I felt a chill run down my spine hearing these words. So that's why David had insisted on examining me, claiming concern about my blood pressure. He was collecting evidence, confirming his suspicions. "What do you want?" Eleanor abruptly asked, her tone changing to something more calculating. "Money? The estate? I can make a deal." Richard's reaction was immediate and surprising. A bitter laugh escaped his lips, a sound I had never heard from him before. "Even now, you still think you can control everything, don't you, Mother? That you can buy your way out of any situation?" "We want justice," David firmly declared. "For Grandpa William, for my mother, for all the patients who died in Munich." Eleanor straightened her shoulders, recovering part of her imposing posture. "Circumstantial evidence," she said with disdain. "The testimony of a senile gardener, old documents that can easily be falsified. Do you really think anyone would believe you against me? Against the Thornton family?" It was at that moment that I found my voice, that voice that had been silenced by 40 years of fear and manipulation. I rose slowly, feeling all eyes turned to me. "I would believe," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "I would testify, would tell everything I saw that stormy night, everything I read in your diary, all the threats I suffered over the years." For the first time, I saw fear completely take over Eleanor's face. It was no longer a flash, but an expression of pure terror. She knew, just as I did, that my testimony would be devastating. A daughter-in-law kept drugged for decades, prevented from raising her own children, threatened with having her tongue cut out if she spoke. It was the kind of story that not even the power of the Thorntons could silence. It was Lawrence who broke the impasse. With a sudden movement, he tried to push past David and reach the door. My son, younger and stronger, easily stopped him. In the struggle that followed, Lawrence stumbled, falling heavily against the desk. A sharp sound of pain escaped his lips, and he brought his hand to his chest, his face contorting in agony. "He's having a heart attack," exclaimed Caroline, running to help him. David, with the calm of a trained doctor, immediately began first aid procedures while Richard called for an ambulance. Amidst the chaos, I saw Eleanor retreat to a corner of the room, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, as if she finally realized that her carefully constructed empire was crumbling before her eyes. The ambulance arrived in record time, but it was already too late for Lawrence. He died on the way to the hospital, the victim of a massive heart attack. A cruel irony, I thought, that he would have the same end he had helped orchestrate for William Thornton so many years before. In the chaotic hours that followed, between statements to the police about the circumstances of Lawrence's death and calls to lawyers, I realized that Eleanor had disappeared. We found her in her room, sitting motionless in her favorite armchair, staring fixedly at William's portrait on the opposite wall. "He always knew he wasn't the father," she said, without taking her eyes off the portrait, her voice distant, as if speaking to herself. "William knew from the beginning. He agreed to raise Richard as his own, because he was obsessed with having an heir to the Thornton name. But he made me pay for it every day, with small cruelties, private humiliations, constant threats." I looked at Richard, seeing the pain in his eyes as he heard these words. All his life, all his identity was being redefined in those terrible moments. "That doesn't justify murder," he finally said. "Nor what you did to Emily." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes strangely empty. "I don't expect justification or forgiveness," she responded. "I just want you to understand that there was no choice in that time for a woman like me." Her words were interrupted by a strange sound that escaped her throat. Her body stiffened, her right arm fell limp beside the armchair, and her face contorted in an expression of pain. "Stroke," David immediately diagnosed, rushing to her side. "Call the ambulance again." The story seemed to be repeating itself with an almost cruel precision. Again the ambulance, again the race to the hospital. This time, however, Eleanor survived, although the stroke was severe enough to leave her partially paralyzed and with compromised speech. In the hospital, as we waited for news in the aseptic hallway that smelled of disinfectant and fear, Richard held my hand tightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choked, "for everything you went through, for not noticing, for not protecting you." I squeezed his hand back, feeling a strange mixture of emotions. Relief for the truth finally revealed, sadness for the lost years, compassion for the man at my side, who had just discovered that his entire life had been built on lies. "We were both victims," I responded softly, "in different ways, but equally devastating." In the days that followed, while Eleanor fought for her life in the ICU, our family began the painful process of reconstruction. Michael was called back from boarding school, and together, Richard, I, David, Caroline, and Michael faced the difficult task of deciding what to do with the revelations that had shaken our foundations. After long discussions, we opted not to take William's case to the authorities. 40 years had passed, the evidence was circumstantial, and the main accomplice, Lawrence, was dead. Moreover, there was the family name to consider, not out of vanity or pride, but for the employees of the estate, for the families who depended on the Thornton businesses to survive. However, Richard insisted on a complete investigation into the medications that had been administered to me for so many years. David, using his medical contacts and the help of toxicologist colleagues, meticulously documented the compounds found in my system, comparing them with the records of the deceased patients in Munich. "These documents will be kept," decided Richard. "If we ever need them, they'll be there. For now, our priority is your recovery, Emily." And so, slowly, I began my process of detoxification and healing. Without the constant sedatives, my mind gradually cleared, although the years of medication had left sequelae, memory lapses, occasional episodes of confusion, vivid nightmares that woke me up screaming in the middle of the night. Richard, driven by a guilt that I repeatedly told him was unnecessary, became tireless in his efforts to ensure my well-being. He hired the best specialists, adapted an entire wing of the house for my rehabilitation, spent hours by my side reading, talking, simply being present. Eleanor remained in the hospital for weeks before being transferred to a specialized clinic for stroke patient recovery. Her condition remained serious, paralyzed on the right side, with severely compromised speech, dependent on constant care. We visited her regularly, although these visits were tense and loaded with unresolved emotions. During one of these visits, when we were alone in the clinic room, she managed to articulate a few words with great effort. "You won." I looked at that woman who had been my tormentor for decades, now reduced to a frail body in a hospital bed, and didn't feel the triumph she perhaps expected to see in my eyes. Instead, I felt a strange compassion. "It's not about winning or losing, Eleanor," I replied softly. "It never was a competition. You could have accepted me as a daughter. We could have been a real family." A single tear ran down her partially paralyzed face, and for a fleeting moment, I glimpsed something I had never seen before in her eyes: remorse. That night, upon returning to the estate, I looked from my bedroom window at the vast starry sky above the tobacco plantations. After 40 years of forced silence, I had finally found my voice. The path to healing would be long, I knew that. But now, for the first time in decades, I felt I could breathe freely, that I could look to the future with hope instead of fear. The empire of lies had crumbled, and from the ruins perhaps we could build something new, something based not on secrets and manipulation, but on truth and understanding. If not for Eleanor, whose choices had led her down a dark path from which there was no return, at least for us, Richard, me, our children, and the generations that would come after us. "The truth," I murmured to the stars, finally liberated after 40 years of silence. The years that followed the fall of the Thornton Empire of Lies were ones of profound transformation, not just for me, but for the entire family. Like a plant that finally finds light after decades in darkness, I slowly began to unfold, to rediscover parts of myself that had been suffocated for so long. Physical recovery came first. Without the medications that had kept my body and mind numbed for 40 years, I experienced a clarity that was both liberating and frightening. Colors seemed more vibrant, sounds sharper, emotions more intense. There were days when this intensity was almost unbearable, when I felt like a newborn child, hypersensitive to every stimulus. "This is normal," explained Dr. Harrison, the neurologist David brought to follow me. "Your brain is readjusting after decades of chemical suppression. It's as if it were relearning to process the world." The nights were particularly difficult. Vivid nightmares would wake me up screaming, fragmented scenes from the past mixing in disturbing sequences. Eleanor threatening to cut out my tongue. Lawrence preparing syringes with unknown liquids. William Thornton, a man I never knew in life, observing me accusingly from his portrait. Richard, driven by a guilt I insisted wasn't his, slept in an armchair next to my bed, ready to calm me when the nightmares came. "I'm here," he would murmur, holding my trembling hands. "You're safe now." Emotional recovery was a slower and more complex process. How to rebuild an identity that had been systematically dismantled over decades. How to learn to trust, to love freely, to express opinions without the constant fear of retaliation. Therapy helped. Long sessions with a patient psychologist who guided me through the labyrinth of trauma. Gradually, I rebuilt the narrative of my life, separating what had been real from what had been fabricated by Eleanor and Lawrence's manipulation. "You're a survivor, Mrs. Thornton, Doctor," Karen would say during our sessions. "What you endured would have destroyed many people, but you found ways to preserve your core, your essence. It was true. Even in the darkest moments, when my mind was most clouded by the medications, I had kept an inner flame lit, that small silent resistance that allowed me to hide pills, memorize patterns, protect fragments of my true personality. My children were fundamental in this process of reconstruction. David, with his unwavering determination and medical knowledge, supervised every aspect of my physical recovery. Caroline, sensitive and intuitive, spent hours with me, relearning small joys, the music I had always loved, the gardening that had been my passion before marriage. And Michael, the youngest, brought me books, opening for me worlds to which I had been denied access for so long. "It's as if we were really getting to know our mother for the first time," Caroline commented one afternoon while teaching me to play a simple melody on the piano in the music room, a chamber of the mansion I had rarely frequented before. Those words touched me deeply. It was true. My children were getting to know the real Emily, not the medicated and erased version that Eleanor had allowed them to see. And I was also truly getting to know them, without the constant interference that had distorted our relationship for so many years. Richard went through his own journey of self-discovery, perhaps even more complex than mine. The revelation that Lawrence, not William, was his biological father shook the very foundations of his identity. His entire life had been built around the Thornton legacy, around being the heir to that empire. Now, in his early 50s, he needed to redefine who he was. "Sometimes I look in the mirror and look for traces of him," he confessed to me one night, his voice low and thoughtful. "Of Lawrence. I try to remember if there was anything in his behavior toward me that indicated he knew, that he felt some paternal connection." I held his hand, feeling a renewed tenderness for this man who, like me, had been manipulated his entire life. "You are yourself, Richard," I responded softly. "Not William, not Lawrence, just Richard." It was a painful but necessary process, peeling away the layers of lies to find the truth at its core. To my surprise, our relationship, which had been distant and superficial for so many years, began to flourish in this unexpected terrain of shared vulnerability. We were truly getting to know each other for the first time as a man and a woman, not as pieces on Eleanor's chessboard. Eleanor remained in the specialized clinic, her condition sometimes slightly improving, sometimes relapsing. Visits to her were an exercise in conflicting emotions. There were days when the anger for everything she had done to me seemed unbearable, others when I felt a strange compassion for that now fragile woman, prisoner of a body that no longer obeyed her iron will. It was during one of these visits, in the year 1986, that Eleanor suffered a second stroke, more severe than the first. David was with me that day and acted quickly, but the damage was already done. She fell into a deep coma connected to machines, her life reduced to pulsating lines on monitors and the rhythmic sound of machines. The medical team was clear. There was no expectation of recovery. We gathered the family to make the most difficult decision, to turn off the machines that kept her artificially alive. She left explicit instructions, informed the family lawyer, presenting a document signed years before. She did not wish to be kept alive by artificial means if there was no prospect of recovery. Even at the end, Eleanor maintained control, deciding the circumstances of her own departure. There was a certain dark poetry in it, I thought, as we watched the last breath leave her body, finally releasing her from the confines of her own web of lies. The funeral was a small, sober ceremony. The few friends who attended were more business acquaintances than truly close relationships. I realized, watching the coffin being lowered into the ground, that Eleanor had lived as isolated in her world of control and manipulation as I had in my prison of medications. In a way, we had both been victims, I of her actions, she of her own fears and obsessions. With Eleanor's death, the last link to the dark past was broken. We all felt a strange relief mixed with an indefinable melancholy. It was the end of an era, the closing of a painful chapter, but also the beginning of something new, not yet written. In the years that followed, the Thornton estate underwent profound transformations. Richard, freed from his mother's oppressive shadow, implemented changes he had desired for years. Work practices were modernized, better conditions offered to employees, part of the land converted into a nature reserve. "This place carries many painful memories," he said one afternoon as we walked through the newly renovated gardens. "But it's also our home, the home of hundreds of families who depend on the estate. We can't erase the past, but we can build a different future." That was exactly what we were doing, day after day, brick by brick, building a future that didn't deny the past but refused to be defined by it. My own transformation continued in small daily steps. I returned to studying, something that had been interrupted when I married at 19. I started with basic books, slowly advancing until I enrolled in correspondence courses. The joy of learning, of expanding my mind after decades of intellectual confinement, was indescribable. In the year 1990, at 53, I achieved a dream I had abandoned in my youth. I graduated as a teacher. It was a simple certification to teach in the early grades, but for me, it represented a monumental victory over everything that had tried to diminish me. With Richard's support, we inaugurated a school on the estate for the employees' children. Small at first, just a room with donated desks and used books, but growing each year. Teaching those children, seeing their eyes light up with new knowledge, became my greatest joy. "You tell stories differently, Mrs. Thornton," a student commented one day, "as if you had lived each one of them." I smiled, touched by the child's innocent perception. In a way, it was true. Each book I read to them, each lesson I taught, was colored by my own experiences, the darkness I had known, and the light I had finally found. Grandchildren began to arrive in the early 90s, first David's children, then Caroline's, and finally, to our surprise, Michael announced that his partner was expecting twins. Each new life was received with a joy that seemed almost excessive, as if we were compensating for all the years of suppressed emotions. With the grandchildren, I experienced a second chance to be the mother I couldn't be for my own children. Free from Eleanor's manipulations, from Lawrence's drugs, I could fully embrace the role of grandmother, telling stories, teaching small skills, simply being present in a way that had never been allowed before. "Grandma, tell again how it was when you were a little girl," they would ask, nestling around me on Sunday afternoons. And I would tell not just the happy stories of my childhood before marriage, but also softened versions of the difficult years, adapted for young ears. It was important to me that they understand, even in a simplified way, the value of truth, the danger of secrets kept too long. Sometimes, I would explain to them, staying silent when we should speak makes small problems grow until they become impossible to control monsters. In the year 2000, when I turned 63, Richard organized a surprise celebration. It wasn't my birthday, nor any special date on the calendar. It was, he explained emotionally during dinner with the whole family gathered, the 15th anniversary of freedom, marking the time since the truth had finally come to light, since I began my journey of recovery. It was on that night, surrounded by children, grandchildren, friends I had made in recent years, that I made a decision. It was time to share my complete story, not just with my immediate family, who already knew the main outlines, but with all my descendants. "I want you to know," I said, my voice firm despite the emotion that threatened to choke me, "what it means to keep a secret for 40 years. I want you to understand the price of silence so that you never are forced to pay it." In the following weeks, with the help of Caroline, who had become a talented writer, I began to record my memories. It was a painful process to relive each dark moment, each manipulation, each day lost in the fog of medications. But it was also cathartic, a final way to exorcise the ghosts that, even after so many years, still sometimes visited me in the darkest hours of the night. The manuscript grew page after page of carefully reconstructed memories. It wasn't just my story, I realized, but also Richard's, our children's, even Eleanor and Lawrence's. It was the chronicle of how secrets and lies can corrode the foundations of a family, generation after generation, until someone finds the courage to say enough. When we finished, in the autumn of that same year, we held a private ceremony in the estate's library. Each adult member of the family received a copy, bound in simple leather, with the title engraved in golden letters, 40 Years of Silence. "This isn't a book for the world," I explained, looking at the attentive faces around me. "It's for us, so we never forget, so the generations that will come after us understand the value of truth, even when it's painful." Richard, now with completely gray hair, but the same gentle eyes that had captivated me in my youth, squeezed my hand. "It's also a story of survival," he added, "of how it's possible to find light even after decades in darkness." He was right, I realized. My life wasn't just a story of victimization, but also of resistance. Not just of loss, but also of rediscovery. Not just of pain, but also, finally, of healing. Today, at 84, I look back and see the long path traveled, from the innocent young woman who entered the Thornton estate full of dreams, to the medicated and silenced prisoner, to the survivor who finally found her voice. Each version of me is part of the whole. Each experience shaped me into the woman I became. The secrets that forced me into silence for 40 years now rest in the light, stripped of their power to hurt. The threats that terrorized me for so long, "If a word about this leaves your mouth, I'll cut out your tongue," are now just distant echoes, unable to reach the present. I look at my grandchildren, now young adults beginning their own journeys, and at my great-grandchildren, still children full of curiosity and potential. I see in them the promise of generations that will not carry the weight of the secrets that almost destroyed our family. Generations that will know the value of truth, of open communication, of love that doesn't come with conditions or manipulations. It is for them, mainly, that I break the final silence by sharing this story, so they understand that even the deepest wounds can heal, that even the darkest secrets lose their power when brought to light, that even after 40 years of silence, it's possible to find your voice again. And when you find it, there's no sweeter melody in the world than the truth finally liberated. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Also share it with someone who might need courage to break their own silence. And don't forget to tell me in the comments what moved you the most, or where you're watching from. Each of your comments makes me feel that these 40 years of silence weren't in vain if they can help other people find their own voices. Thank you very much for listening to me until now.